There's a difference between a name that was simply recorded and a name that was recorded, and then had to survive everything that came after. Tonight's 10 names were all documented in Jamaica's 1817 registers, present on paper, years before freedom was even a legal possibility. What makes tonight different is what we found looking forward from that point. What happened to these same 10 names when freedom finally actually arrived? Some of them fought for it years before the law caught up. One of them wrote the definitive first-hand account of what came before it. One of them, a formerly enslaved woman, spent years after freedom writing to the British government asking where the money had gone. And one of them led a rebellion, decades after emancipation, because he'd learned the hard way that freedom on paper and freedom in practice were two very different things. And before we even get to tonight's 10, there's a name worth knowing that isn't on the list at all. On July 10, 1835, a Baptist minister bought 25 acres of land in the hills of St. Catherine for £100 and cut it into quarter-acre lots, selling each one for £3 to anyone recently freed who could scrape the money together. The very first person to buy one, the first free landowner in the history of Jamaica, was a man named Henry Lunan, formerly the headman at Hampstead Estate. A headman is not a small job on a plantation. It's the man who ran the work gangs for the people who enslaved him. And the very first thing he did with whatever freedom and savings he'd managed to hold on to was buy £3 worth of land that no one could ever again tell him to leave. 10 names tonight, all there before freedom came. Let's see what happened next. Here's what most people never got told about how freedom actually arrived in Jamaica. It didn't happen in a single moment. On August 1st, 1834, slavery was legally abolished, but almost nobody was actually freed that day. Instead, a system called apprenticeship forced most formerly enslaved people to keep working for their old enslavers, unpaid, for up to 40.5 hours a week for another 4 to 6 years. Historians have called it slavery under a different name, and plenty of the people living through it agreed. Oral histories describe former slaves who genuinely believed 1834 was a hoax, bracing for the same disappointment to repeat itself in 1838. Full unconditional freedom didn't arrive until August 1st, 1838. And when compensation was paid out for the loss the system caused, the £20 million went entirely to the enslavers. The formerly enslaved received nothing, which is exactly why land mattered so much the moment freedom actually came. Planters refused to sell land to the people they'd just been forced to free, hoping to trap them into staying as cheap labor with nowhere else to go. Free villages like Sligaville, Sturgetown, and Maidstone were the direct answer to that trap. Communities where formerly enslaved families pooled whatever money they had to buy land planters didn't want, just to be able to say no. Tonight's 10 names were all documented before any of that happened. We tracked each one forward, as far as the record allows, to see what they were doing when the moment finally came. If your name's on tonight's list, tell us what your own family's freedom story looks like. 1834, 1838, or somewhere in between. And if it's not on the list, tell us anyway, especially if your family has a free village connection. Sligaville, Sturgetown, Maidstone, or anywhere else founded in those first years after 1838. Subscribe if this is new to you. New records, new surnames, every week. Quick note before we count down. The tool linked below lets you check your own surname against everything we've documented so far, before and after freedom both. It's exactly how tonight's 10 got selected. 10 names. Let's go. Number 10. Marley. Documented in St. Anne Parish in the 1817 registers, tied to a layered mix of Akan and Bight of Biafra ancestry, this channel has already traced Saint Anne was also home to some of the earliest post-emancipation free villages, as formerly enslaved families pooled what little money they had to buy small plots of land the moment the law finally allowed it. The same instinct that drove Henry Lunan to St. Catherine, playing out in parish after parish across the island at once. Number 9. Gordon. Here's a name whose real freedom story doesn't even happen at emancipation. It happens 27 years later. George William Gordon, born to an enslaved mother and a white plantation owner, became a businessman and political figure who spent his adult life arguing that legal freedom in 1838 hadn't actually delivered fairness for black Jamaicans, that land, wages, and political representation all remained locked away from the very people the law claimed to have freed. In 1865, he was executed by the colonial government for his alleged role in the Morant Bay Rebellion. A reminder that for some families, the fight tied to this name didn't end when slavery did. It just changed shape and changed targets, and kept going for another generation. Number 8. Robinson. Documented in the compensation records tied to the Congo and Mbundu corridor, this channel has already traced. Robinson's presence in the compensation database is itself a Freedom-era document. The payment wasn't made to anyone who had been enslaved. It was made to the people who had, until that point, owned them for the loss of that ownership. Every Robinson entry in that database is, in effect, a receipt for a transaction the formerly enslaved were never party to and never saw a shilling from. Number 7. Barnett, Trelawney, tied to the Barnett estate in Maroon Country. There's a second, separate Barnett in Jamaica's record. Jonathan Barnett, the privateer who captured the pirate Calico Jack Rackham in 1720, a full century before this list story even begins. Same name, two completely different eras of Jamaican history, neither one related to the other, except by coincidence of spelling. A reminder that 100 years of Jamaican history can pass between two people who happen to share 6 letters. Number 6. Campbell. The most common surname in Jamaica, and one already tied on this channel to Highland Scotland, to the Gold Coast, and to the word crooked mouth in Gaelic. By the time freedom fully arrived in 1838, Campbell was already so widespread across the island that no single estate or parish could claim it. It became, in the years after emancipation, one of the most common names carried into the free villages springing up across the island. Proof that a name imposed under slavery didn't disappear the moment slavery legally ended. Families kept it and made it their own. Number 5. Forbes, tied to Manchester Parish and an Edinburgh banking claim before freedom came. But the more remarkable Forbes story continues well past 1838. Rose Ann Forbes, Mammy Forbes, ran one of Jamaica's most important bomb yards for at least 30 years into the 20th century, prosecuted twice for offering healing the colonial government refused to recognize as legitimate. Freedom came in 1838. The fight over who got to define legitimate healing, legitimate religion, legitimate knowledge, kept going for generations after. Before the top 4, the story of Henry Lunan deserves more than a mention in passing. He wasn't a wealthy man, and he wasn't famous in his own lifetime. Just a headman, the enslaved person given the job of overseeing other enslaved people's labor on the Hampstead estate. When Reverend James Filippo bought his 25 acres in the hills above Spanish Town in July of 1835 and started selling it off in quarter-acre lots for £3 each, Lunan was the very first person in the entire history of the island to walk up and buy one. Behind him came others whose names survive in the same record: Robert Talbot, William James, James Henry, Lewis Harvey, George Coburn, a woman named Elizabeth, whose surname the surviving document cuts off. None of them are famous. None of them owned a plantation or wrote a book that got published in London. What they did was smaller and, in its own way, just as significant. The moment the door opened even slightly, they were the first ones through it, 3 pounds at a time, turning a hillside called Highgate into a town that would eventually be renamed Sligaville. And that would go on a century later to become the birthplace of an entirely different kind of freedom movement, when the first Rastafarian settlement in Jamaican history was founded on that same ground in 1940. Number 4. Nembhard, St. Elizabeth. And this name's freedom story actually starts before freedom was ever legally on the table. In 1815, more than 250 enslaved Igbo people in this exact parish organized a plan to kill every enslaver on the island and take their freedom by force, 19 years before the law would even begin the process. The plot was discovered before it happened. Whatever this family's specific connection to that conspiracy, the surname sits in the same parish, the same years, as people who decided they weren't going to wait for permission. Number 3. Vassal. Technically a Massachusetts story, but it starts in Jamaica, and it's the clearest before and after freedom narrative this channel has ever found. Tony and Cuba Vassal were enslaved, brought from a Jamaican-connected household to a mansion in Cambridge built on Jamaican sugar money. When their enslavers fled as loyalists in 1774, 60 years before Jamaica's own apprenticeship system even began, Tony and Cuba seized the moment and took their freedom immediately, without waiting for anyone's law to catch up. They later successfully petitioned the Massachusetts government for a pension, arguing plainly that after decades of unpaid labor between them, they shouldn't be left to beg in old age. Their son Darby lived to 92, having spent his entire adult life free, a full 6 decades before slavery would even legally end on the island where his parents were born. Long enough to watch an entire American century pass, and long enough to help build one of Boston's first free black communities out of nothing but his own name and his own refusal to disappear. Number 2. Norris, St. David. 231 enslaved people registered in 1832, right at the very edge of the system's end. This is the name with the sharpest after story on tonight's list. In 1839, a year after full freedom finally arrived, a woman named Ellen Blades wrote directly to the British Compensation Commission, explaining that her father's will had locked the Norris Head property so it could never be sold, and that she had never received what she believed she was owed. She described herself as the wife of a Chelsea hospital pensioner, having been, in her own words, buffeted about in the world, and suffering many privations. Freedom came in 1838. For this family, the paperwork fighting over what freedom actually meant financially was still very much unresolved a year later, and the Commission's answer, when it finally came, was simply that it was too late to claim anything at all. Number 1. Wedderburn. James Wedderburn owned 8 properties across Westmoreland, worth over £300,000, documented well before any of tonight's other entries. But his son Robert didn't wait for 1834 or 1838 either. Born in 1762 to an enslaved woman named Rosanna, Robert escaped to the Royal Navy at 16, and in 1824, a full decade before apprenticeship even began, he published The Horrors of Slavery in London, naming his own father directly as the man responsible for his mother's suffering. He was arrested for blasphemy for his radical preaching, and he never once softened what he'd witnessed as a child. Robert Wedderburn wrote the ending to slavery's story before the British government had even finished writing the law that would supposedly end it. If your surname is Wedderburn, you're carrying the name of a man who didn't wait to be freed on paper. He simply started telling the truth, in print, a decade before anyone in power was ready to hear it. 10 names, all documented before freedom legally existed in Jamaica, and 10 completely different answers to what happened when it finally did. Some families waited. Some, like the Vassals and Robert Wedderburn himself, refused to wait at all. Some, like Ellen Blades, spent years afterward still fighting over what freedom was actually supposed to include. And some, like George William Gordon decades later, discovered that legal freedom and actual fairness were never quite the same promise. And somewhere outside tonight's 10, there's Henry Lunan, a headman who spent his whole enslaved life managing other people's forced labor, and who used the very first chance he ever got to buy 3 pounds of hillside that belonged to nobody but himself. No book, no rebellion, no courtroom letter. Just a man, first in line, the moment the line finally opened. Drop your surname and parish below, and tell us your own family's freedom story if you know it. Especially if it runs through a free village like Sligaville, Sturgetown, or Maidstone. And go check your own name using the tool linked in the description. Freedom didn't arrive the same way for anyone on tonight's list. It never really does. It just finally, eventually, arrived. And what people did with it, the moment it did, is its own kind of record worth keeping.